Today is November 18th, 2019. This is Ken Schoen from the Jewish Historical Society of Western Massachusetts, and I have the pleasure of being together with John Sinton, who will share with us today some things about his life, where he's been, and where his family has come from. So John, welcome, and please tell me how you got to Western Massachusetts and some of the things you're currently involved with.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here with you. We are now, my wife Wendy and I are now living in Florence, Massachusetts. Part of it's a village in Northampton, and we have returned. We got married in 1970 when I was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Massachusetts, and Wendy had just returned from 2 years in the Philippines, and we met in anthropology class, and she was the prettiest girl in class by far, and I fell in love with her, and we started dating. Just prior to that, I had been a Russian historian at Union College, but they fired me as an arrogant young man because I wouldn't. I was unpleasant. I was an unpleasant colleague. I would not, for example, invite my chairman over to dinner, and so he told me that I was. He simply took me into his office and said, "You're fired," and that was the end of that. I left having been nominated the best teacher at Union College, and I restructured my life, became a environmental planner. Married Wendy in our field of bluets in the backyard on Tewaddle Hill in Leverett. Then left and helped start a college, Stockton University now in southern New Jersey, 27 years down there, returned and settled in Florence, where I've been for 20 years. Fell in love with the river that runs by our house, the Mill River, the river that ran through downtown Northampton but has been diverted out of it. The river is now a ghost river, where it could have been a greenway. So I'm working with friends and local people to create a greenway along the river, which runs all the way from Goshen up in the hill towns, down through Williamsburg and out into East Hampton, where Arcadia is. It's been a work of joy and love, and it's taught me an enormous amount. And I've just returned last week from teaching a 5th grade class in Williamsburg, where I was thrilled at how curious the students were about all things riverine. And that's where we are now.
Tell me about your family history, how your family came to America.
That's a long and winding and wonderful road. It's essentially the story that fits in with other German Jews from the middle of the 19th century, from the 1840s. It has all of the myths that they brought with them and all of the wealth that they managed to make when they came, after they came. My own family came from just about every part of Germany you can imagine. On my father's side, all of these people came in the 1850s. I believe all of them came in the 1850s. On my father's side, they came from the Rhineland, or not far from Frankfurt, on the other side of the Rhine, from Worms, which was, of course, a great Jewish center, a little city of Bürstadt. There were others who came from Baden-Württemberg, which is Stuttgart is the capital. There were others that came from the Franken, which is the northern part of Bavaria, right near Bamberg, north of Nuremberg. And there were others who came from Prussia, from East Prussia, which was on the borders in a place called Kempen, Kempen. They came, there were quite a few of them. Some of them landed in New York and stayed there. There were the Lehman Brothers, for example, the banking families of New York. About a book was written about them called Our Crowd. They became the wealthy Jews of New York City. The lesser known ones, which are now becoming better known, went directly out west because they wanted to, I mean, these were teenage boys, and they married into families that had already arrived. These were teenage boys who were up for some excitement, and out they went. For example, my great-grandfather, my maternal great-grandfather, her father, came from a place called Reckendorf, which is a little dorf, a little village in Franken. And he came with a group of his buddies, some of them named Haas, some of them named Hellman. Among others, you would find this in any number of places in America, where villages, groups of people from villages would all go, and they emigrated into the same area, so they had buddies around them.
What was his name?
His name was Walter Walter, W-A-L-T-E-R.
Last name?
That's his last name.
His name
was Walter. His first name was Isaac, Yitzchak. I suppose they would have spoken Yiddish. They certainly, they considered themselves German. That is, their culture was German. And their religion was Jewish. They formed, along with other Western Jews who came to San Francisco, and in the 1850s, they came in 1856. Los Angeles was not really a place there. There was a mission down in Los Angeles, but San Francisco was the only real city in California at that time. And they formed a temple called Temple Emmanuel. They were among the first of the Zionists. They became, they were Reform Jews, as the Reform Jewish movement had just begun. There were no conservative and no Orthodox Jews in San Francisco. My grandfather, he took over the job of president of a firm that his father and his uncles had begun. It was called D.N. and E. Walter. D.N. was his uncle, Daniel Nathan, and Edgar Walter. His own father, Isaac, was part of the company, but he came over just a little bit later. The whole family, all of the brothers came in.
Why did they come to San Francisco? I mean, here they are in a small
The gold
town
rush.
in Germany.
The gold rush.
The word had gotten out to Germany.
Absolutely. These people, you see, what I discovered about these comparatively wealthy Jews in Germany and along the border up into Prussia, all along that border, is that, well, we talk about the Jews from the shtetl. But there were also major traders and for example, in Reckendorf, they were probably 40% of the town. And they placed themselves along trade routes. So they would have known any number of languages. They would have gotten news from both east in Poland and Russia and from the west, because they were moving goods back and forth.
What kinds of goods were they moving?
I don't know in Germany what they were marketing. That was rather strictly controlled by German authorities. My guess is that they were simply moving whatever came through, whatever was important, whatever was in demand, whether it was wood or they might have moved some finished goods.
Were they financing the ships? What were they doing exactly when you say they were doing it? What was their occupation?
Trader. They were
physically trading these
They were
objects.
they were simply wholesalers, basically. They were moving goods back and forth from Germany, finished goods from Germany back into the areas of Russia and Poland. And I haven't seen any account books. I suppose there would have been. But what they knew was textile, schmada. They certainly understood textiles because that's the firm that they established in San Francisco in 1856. D.N.E. Walter was furnishing business, so they furnished houses, and they made their money off of the enormous number of houses that were being built, and they became, by the turn of the century, the largest wholesalers of furnishings, rugs, tapestries, draperies, carpets, in the whole of the West. By 1920, they had offices in from Salt Lake City up to Seattle down to Los Angeles. So I would imagine that they were in the chiefly textiles when they were in Germany as well.
So they didn't get directly involved in the gold rush itself.
They would never do that.
They came over because they knew there was opportunity.
There was opportunity. They knew where it was. They may have landed in New York first, but then they went around the Horn. They did not go across on Conestoga wagons. They came around the Horn, and I'm sure they knew about the gold rush by the time they came. These were late teenage boys, 18, 19 years old. And the myth of the family, of course, is that they had come because they were about to get shanghaied into the army. But that's not true. At least not as far as I can see. They didn't necessarily. These are little, Germany was not Germany. There were all kinds of little principalities, and so it wasn't not the great 1848 revolutions that scattered the Jews. It was opportunity that they came for. My grandmother's father's family, her father's family were the Walters. Her mother's family was the Schwartzes, and the Schwartzes came from West Prussia, from Kempen. They also were traders. They were closer to Poland. They probably knew Yiddish. And they came and settled in just south of San Francisco. Isidore Schwartz. And he had a brother or two, and they settled down there. in San Luis Obispo County. Isidore very quick, and this was out in the countryside. He became a postmaster, and there were always relationships between people in San Luis Obispo, which is, I would say, 100 miles south of San Francisco, and the Jews in San Francisco. The Jews all knew each other, in that whole West Coast area. To give you an example of how tight the village, that group of villages were. Let me give you the example that we know about, and because I went back to Reckendorf. The Jews from Reckendorf. My grandmother had a photograph of the house that her parents lived in, which was a considerable it was a considerable house. It was a Fachwerk house, a half-timbered house, 3 stories tall, and from time to time my great-grandparents would return to Europe and go back to Reckendorf. This would have been in the 1860s, 1870s, and they would go back, and what my mother had was the image of this house. My grandmother, I believe, never did go back to visit Reckendorf. But as a matter of fact, nobody after that generation, that first generation, went back to visit Reckendorf. I believe I was the first of the group to return to Reckendorf. This would have been 1985 approximately. So it had been almost 100 years since a Walter had returned. Now what I discovered was that there were at least 3 families who came, three young men who came from there. There would have been the Walters, the group of Walters, that would be a number of them. The Haases came from there, H-A-A-S, and they went to San Francisco as well. The Hellmans went there as well, H-E-L-L-M-A-N, whom my children called Mrs. Mayonnaise, although no relation at all. And they all settled in San Francisco. My mother, who found being Jewish rather problematic, and was interested in particular in Jean-Paul Sartre, his take on the Jew, on what is a Jew. And she was conflicted, let me put it that way, because she didn't want to be pigeonholed as a Jew, nor did she want to be pigeonholed as a woman. Well, that's a whole other story. But regardless of that, these 3 families of Jews came over. They became really quite wealthy.
How did she feel pigeonholed as a Jew? What did that mean exactly? Sartre talked about Jews being defined as Jews by the anti-Semites in the world, so to speak, that the world defined the Jews.
That was her problem. She had a problem with her internal dialogue. Am I a Jew? I don't go to... She didn't like being Jewish. She just didn't like being Jewish.
What do you think being Jewish meant to her exactly?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking about that right now. I think it meant that she should go to shul. She should not have had Christmas trees, which we had every year. She should, if she were a Jew, she would admit it, and she didn't want to admit it. That was the problem. There were other people in the family who were extra Jewish. Her brother-in-law, my father's brother, would tell Jewish jokes endlessly, on and on and on. And his brother was very important in Jewish benefits. Both communal affairs, both of my grandparents were president of the Temple Emmanuel.
These are your mother's father.
But the Walters, my mother grew up rather differently. This is the Sintons, that's a different family. But the Walters were they wanted to be part of American culture, which they became. They greatly succeeded at that, but the cost was their identity. I think it's an old story. But it only becomes, when you personalize it, when you can evoke it, you can understand from this particular case what it was like to be a not Jew. That's why that family is interesting in that way. But to finish off the rest of the story about the kids from Reckendorf, they all became extremely wealthy, including my family. And I finally took my mother back in 1985. We were living in Switzerland at the time on an exchange, university exchange. And so I took her to Reckendorf. I had been there before, and the town of Reckendorf had begun to reconcile its history with the Jews. And I lived in Germany later as well, in the 90s. And that reconciliation, which in German is called Versöhnung, which has to do with being the son, being part of the family.
Atonement.
Atonement is better.
There's the word sin in it also.
Yeah. And the Germans, I believe, are doing an extraordinary job of that.
So you went back with your mother?
I went back with my mother, and she was, at 6s and 7s, I could see her mind trying to place some kind of label on this experience. Like, what am I feeling? And she really couldn't go there. The temple was still there, although it had been turned into it had become a kind of empty space. It had been used as a storehouse. The mayor took us around. He was a drunk, but so I had to be translating drunken German to my mother, who didn't ask very many questions. I took her out to the Friedhof, to the cemetery, which is up on the hill just outside. It's a beautiful place with a beautiful view, and there were the graves of my relatives, of the Walters there. But this is what she did instead. I took her around because I said, where are the houses, where are the Elmans, and here's the Walter house. We visit that first. That she could label. This is the photograph. She was quite proud of that. This is big. It had been turned into a kindergarten, but it had been its half-timbered structure was still there. It's beautifully integrated in a beautiful house, big old house. And then we went down and we visited the Hellman's house, which was also pretty nice. And she approved of that. And then we went around to see the Haas house, where the Haas family was. And that was not far from the brewery, Reckenbräu. There's a little brewery there. This was not that important a house, clearly. It was only 2 stories, not so big. She looked at the house and said, the Haases, they never were much. Now, the Haases are related to Levi Strauss. They own the Gap. They own the Oakland A's.
That's Mishpacha to you?
Yeah.
That's family to you?
Yes. Yeah.
Tell me about the...
So the village never left there. She didn't like Elise Haas, is basically what it was. I didn't even know Elise, but she didn't think much of her, and Elise wasn't even a Haas. Anyway.
Do you think your grandparents were in Germany Reformed Jews in their hometown?
No, the hometown, no, that's an Orthodox. Oh, no question.
It was Orthodox.
It was
so
Orthodox.
Do you think they actually went to synagogue? They were observant
yes,
there?
they were, oh yes. They were observant. And my grandfather was, their son, Isaac's son Jack, John Walter. They had 2 sons, John and Edgar. And while they were observant, they weren't particularly interested in Jewish affairs or in religion. They certainly weren't particularly interested in the temple. They spent all of their time in the arts and culture. My grandfather loved the theater. He was apparently one of these voluble, extraordinary master of ceremonies type people. Ran the business with great flair. Was a man about town. He knew everybody in town. Was a friend of gentleman Jim Corbett, the boxer. And he was a presence. Clearly a presence.
And his being Jewish was known. He didn't hide his
Oh,
Jewish.
he didn't hide. No. He was, he didn't mind being Jewish at all. Nor did his brother, Edgar, called Uncle Gar, who became an artist of some note and a sculptor. He had studied in France. His work is still in the Opera House in San Francisco. His proscenium and those kinds of things that he did.
His full name again is?
Edgar Walter and John Isaac Walter.
Do you think your family at this time, when they were coming and into the 1900s, experienced any form of anti-Semitism in San Francisco?
They did not. They neither behaved nor, I think, felt any ill will from their neighbors. They accepted. They had a different take. That generation had a different take. They accepted their separateness. They would certainly be separated out, but there was an understanding that they were integrated into that society, integrated but separate. For example, the girls were not invited to the parties. I was invited to the cotillion, as boys were. They always need extra boys, so Jewish boys were accepted into that. And we were the right kind of Jews because we behaved precisely as the Christians, as the...
You fit into
we
that
fit,
culture.
totally fit in. And it was German, they spoke German. They did not speak Yiddish with each other.
Up to what point did they speak German to each other? To what generation was this lingua franca?
Oh, only the first generation.
Did they form their own social clubs, the Jews?
Absolutely.
The Union Club? What did they call themselves?
Was it the Union Club?
But they did form their own society.
Oh, they formed their own society, yes. I knew that they knew they were Jews. They always talked about in Jewish terms, like, is he one of ours? As you know, there was clear separation, but they were comfortable, except for my mother. My father was not comfortable. Really, his role model, if were he able to return to the earth, he would have been Fred Astaire. And when he told me that he would love to be Fred Astaire, I said, "What kind of a Jew is that?" Well, it turns out that Fred Astaire, I think his grandparents were Jewish, so Fred Astaire, in fact, Goy, though he clearly behaved, did have some Jewish background.
What do you think it was about Fred Astaire that he admired himself?
He danced lightly. He went through life
Buoyant.
yet skipping over the surface. My father was never more happy than when he was in an airplane moving from one place to another. He would visit us for no longer than 24 hours.
He was a Luftmensch in a way. Not really.
Yes, he was a Luftmensch, but he wasn't a... Yeah.
Tell me about
Yeah.
your father and his family, if you want to, where his family came from and how he arrived at this place in his life and what he did.
Well, I couldn't find as much as I wanted to. Now, I know that his mother, an Eisman, and there's an Eisman around here. Most of the Eismans are East Coast. All of them I know are East Coasters. Chiefly Boston and Philadelphia. A couple in New York. My grandmother was born in Iowa because her family was there for a short time. There were people in Mississippi and Louisiana sometimes. There was a part of the family, I think, an Eisman. It could have been a Koshland. It was one of those kind of side families somewhere I haven't traced, who I think was a Confederate soldier. But you would find Jews, and it's kind of like Chinese restaurants. In these places, you would have found Jews in the mid-19th century in a lot of small towns throughout the Midwest. And I think they certainly moved on after that, for the most part. In Texas, they didn't, they had little Atlanta in the major cities. But my grandfather, Sinton, Zinsheimer, Sinsheimer, Zinsheimer. The Zinsheimer came from across the Rhine River from Worms. A little town called Bierstadt, about halfway between Worms and Frankfurt. So they would have been very much involved with the Frankfurt Jews or the Worms Jews. It was that group that would have come into the Rhineland. Most of these Jews would have come in from the Ashkenazi Jews, would have settled in Germany as the German states were breaking down and during the Reformation and the terrible religious wars. The 30 Years' War, where in some places in Germany, 70% of the population just disappeared. My own reading of that history is that the Jews occupied a number of places after that series of wars. But anyway, they ended up, and I think they were probably 3 generations there anyway before they emigrated. So they would have come in probably the 1600s.
Immigrated
to the Rhineland. They would have come from the east and come into the Rhineland and settled in these towns. And the Zinsheimers moved as basically, again, a bunch of brothers. They came in. Some Zinsheimers went down to San Luis Obispo. Again, there's the connection. Other Zinsheimers went up into San Francisco. And they got into the wool business. And the wool business got them involved with ranching. So they settled, the Zinsheimers in San Luis Obispo became ranchers, Jewish ranchers. I know it sounds odd, but they became wealthy down there, ranching and in the sheep and in the wool trade. The wool trade was part of the Zinsheimer family up in San Francisco, so the wool would be shipped to the East Coast, where it would be used in the mills in the Merrimack Valley and in Massachusetts. So this is where the woolen mills were, out here, and that was the connection. So they had family connections. The East people, this family and other families in New York and Boston, Philadelphia, were all interconnected. My father, so much so that my grandfather Stanley, whose father was which Sinsheimer? Henry Sinsheimer, who was the emigre from Bierstadt, from the Rhineland. Stanley set up shop with his father in the wool trade, and his brother Edgar, another Edgar here, seemed a very popular name, became a lawyer in San Francisco. And the wool trade was so important to the family that my grandfather Stanley, who was he was not a cultured man. He was the opposite of the other grandfather. He was a man's man. Stan the man. He had a mistress. He had, and he was gruff and rough. He taught me how to hunt. He took me hunting. But before that, he had been sent out to Boston. So he and his wife, Edna, the Eisman family, that's a different thing. My father was born in 1909 on Commonwealth Avenue in a significant house in Back Bay. The house still stands, of course. It's on Commonwealth. And he was brought up as an East Coaster and always had an East Coast accent. He would talk about Boston and family and had this air about him that was cultured. He was quite cultured. He was sent to Phillips Exeter Academy as one of the 10% there. His brothers as well, they behaved properly. They were very good Goyish Jews. Although they were part of the temple, they were quite Jewish themselves. So he had this, and then he went to Yale. All of the boys went to Exeter, and then they went to Yale, all of them. My grandfather, who had long since moved back to San Francisco, he had gone to the University of California. He had been born in San Francisco. He'd gone to the University of California at Berkeley. The other grandfather went to Stanford. So, these stories can go on and on. In any case, my grandfather became a broker, a stockbroker, and set up a Jewish firm in San Francisco. as a stockbroker. Can't remember the name of the firm. It got bought out by another firm, and
He was successful.
he was very successful. These were all very successful people. They had far more money than I do now. I am that fourth generation that is wasting all of the money on people's education and this sort of thing.
So this is your father's father.
This is my father's father.
So he was in San Francisco. Did he bring his son?
He was part of the temple. I mean, he felt Jewish.
Did he go from San Francisco to Boston?
But he was sent out by the family to Boston.
And that's where he met.
That's where he lived.
And met your mother? Met your grandmother?
His roots were always in San Francisco.
He met his wife there.
My father met.
We're talking about your grandfather, I think. Your grandfather.
My grandfather.
The brokerage firm, right?
My grandfather married Edna Eisman in San Francisco.
And brought her to Boston.
And married her. They set up house in San Francisco for some years, and then they moved to Boston in the first decade of the 20th century. So, right, 1920, and then they returned to San Francisco sometime around 1930.
So was your
Your
father was brought up in Boston or San Francisco?
He was brought up in both. He's bi-coastal.
Okay.
He took on the cultured voice. He was the only brother. There were three brothers.
But he went to Phillips Exeter. He came back from that, and then he went to Yale.
No, he was still. They were still living in Boston during that time.
Oh, at that time.
So they wouldn't have moved back to San Francisco until the beginning of the Depression.
What was
So
expected?
he graduated from Yale, would have been late 1920s.
What was expected of your father and his brothers? What do you think?
Business. It was the same thing expected of me. You go into business.
And what business was expected of your father?
My father married my mother in 1930, just before her father died of Bright's disease, which is a curable kidney disease. Now it's curable. They were married because he wanted to see his first child married. So they married in 1930, then my father went into the business, the D&E Walter business, so he was the son-in-law. He became successful in that business and became president of the firm after the death of an interim president.
Was that out in San Francisco?
In San Francisco,
Is it
yeah.
still doing interior decorating and all that carpeting? What are
No.
they doing now?
They sold
How did they
my
evolve?
father's great coup was to sell the firm when a conglomerate could buy it, when there was still a medium-sized firm that could be sold. This would have been about 1980s.
So he
early
continued
1980s.
doing that company selling
Oh yes,
furnishings,
selling
homes
furnishings.
out of San Francisco.
His brother was part of that company.
Out of San Francisco.
Out of San Francisco.
And then he sold it.
And then he sold it, and now it owns property and a lot of securities.
That firm?
That firm, D&E Walter, still exists. It's not after all this time, but it is a shell of what it was. It doesn't actually do anything. It's a passive company. We still have stock. It helps keep us going. It has allowed our children to get wonderful educations, etc.
So what did your father end up doing after they sold the company?
Oh, he remained there. Yeah. My father remained remained part of the company. Let's see, all he did was to manage money and property. This property was a prime piece of property that Deanna and Walter had held since the late 19th century on Market Street. They moved to Mission Street. They sold that Mission Street property, and now it's another commercial building. There's another building down in Los Angeles that's,
So the company was sold, but the family got stock in this company?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. That's how it...
So your father and mother are in San Francisco?
Meanwhile, there were other kinds of side businesses. There were all kinds of investments on the side as well. My father less so, but my mother's father had business dealings in Guatemala. There was a relative called Irving Stahl, and Irving Stahl had remained in Guatemala as part of some kind of side deal. We called him Don Irving. Don Irving Stahl owned the Mercedes dealership in Guatemala City. There's a picture in here of my grandmother and her sister Pearl in Guatemalan dress. They spent a year down there in Guatemala. There was coffee, there was gold. I have gold, still some gold pieces from the República de Centroamérica. So they were into all. They were robber barons.
So let's talk a bit about your mother now and her work as a binder.
My grandmother?
Or your grandmother?
My grandmother was a grande dame, une grande dame. She was really a highly cultured lady. She was born in 1886. Her sister Pearl in 1888, a couple of years later. They were brought up in quite a grand house. Her father, Isidore, and her mother, I can't remember her name. In any case, they became rich enough doing, I'm not quite sure what. Isidore just became a wealthy man and bought a very large house, kind of a mansion, a wooden mansion in San Francisco where the girls grew up. So they grew up in luxury and in style. They would go to Europe, they would go to Guatemala, they had anything they wished for.
This is how your mother grew up?
My grandmother.
Your grandmother grew up.
In this huge house. Mark Hopkins, who's a famous name in San Francisco, his brother owned that house. So Isidore Schwartz bought Mark Hopkins' brother's house on Clay Street. Huge place, because I do remember the place. And it had a huge carriage house where the cook lived. So she grew up in very high culture. That much we knew. I had to research her background, where they came from, but that's something else. I'm sure she went to Temple. The Schwartzes were important in Temple Emmanuel themselves. But there was no hint that my grandmother was interested in Judaism or the religion. Certainly she never would have spoken either German or Yiddish. She was a rather presumptuous and difficult woman. She would give the back of her hand to cousins whom she didn't care for. There's a famous story of her simply stopping the carriage out on the beach in San Francisco and telling a cousin of hers to get out of the carriage. She simply gave her the back of the hand. Off she went, and had to walk. Oh, we don't know how the cousin got back. She was that kind of a person. But she came upon tragedy early in her life. Her life was haunted, ghosted, with ghosts. Her brother died as a baby or an infant, and she and her sister grew up with knowing that there was death there. And early, it's around 1902 or 3, her father died suddenly. She was only a teenager at the time. But he did leave her. The house was still there. And an estate worth $1 million in 1900 money. And then she and her sister and her mother took a trip to Europe to try to ward off the ill effects of grief. They came back, and within a year or two her mother died. And so she was grieving. A lot of loss in her life, and she took it quite bitterly. It was at this point in time that she and Pearl, two beautiful Jewish girls, were living alone in this mansion, surrounded by servants, of course. But the two boys from Reckendorf family, Jack Walter, my grandfather, and his brother, Gar, descended upon these beautiful girls, swept them off their feet, and they were married in the first decade of the 20th century in very short order. Uncle Gar swept his bride Pearl off to Paris to live and to work, and for the first time in her life, clearly after her childhood, my grandmother was in heaven. She adored Jack Walter, this, very bravo fellow, and she went on this very gay, she's just apparently a most extraordinarily beautiful and cultured. She loved her life at that time, but nobody had asked her about it. And by the time we come some 12 years later or so to 1918 and the flu epidemic, she had 3 children. She lost the only boy, the oldest one, John Walter, after whom I'm named, John I. Walter. So I'm John Walter Sinton. She lost him, more grieving, and then another dozen years later she lost her husband, who died, and all of us children remember her lighting a candle. Every night she would light a candle. She did not talk about her past. We had to dig this all up from various references. My mother would ask her from time to time, and she wouldn't talk about it. Nobody could get her to talk about it. I was too young to try to force it. It had been said that she did not want to talk about her past because her name was Schwartz, and she came from, as my grandmother Eisman said, hinter Berlin, somewhere outside of Berlin, uncultured. One of those people, one of the Schwarzes, Schwartz, they must have been some. My whole life I grew up thinking that my grandmother was embarrassed of her background that she was one of those Jews who came from the Pale or somewhere. But it's hinter Berlin.
You mean ein Polen Juif?
Yeah,
I see. You don't think she was silenced by her grief?
it's exactly what it was. But I didn't know, I only discovered that comparatively recently, maybe 10 years ago. I only putting together the history of this, of the couples, of her marriage and that sort of thing. And my very first clue was, hey, she didn't move in with her husband to that huge house. Her husband moved in with her. It was the Schwartz house. And these Schwartzes came from Kempen, which is in Prussia, which is just as German as Reckendorf, and a bigger town, and on a larger trade route. So after going through that grief, then she's coming out of the grief in the 1940s, she turns to bookbinding. And bookbinding saves her. She discovered that she was an artist. I don't know if she always knew this. All I know is that she had beautiful, gorgeous handwriting in purple ink. But it turns out that she threw herself through and relieved her agony by binding books, by collecting gorgeous limited edition books, and began a collection of one of the finest binders, presses in America, the Grabhorn Press. And she was very proud that she owned almost everything, almost every imprint from that press.
You mean she bound them for her own personal library, or did she bind them for other people?
She bound them for her own self.
So her collection of Grabhorns were in her house for her to enjoy her own beauty, her
Yes.
own work.
Yeah.
Can you show
And
us some of what she's done?
I only wish that I have some at home, but
Why don't you hold up a few pictures just to show us, give us examples of what she had done? Anything will do. Okay.
It's beautiful Art Deco or Nouveau.
And did she become well known for this later on? How did this book get published? How has she become?
She became the president of the Book Club of California, which is the Grolier, or Grolier, is it? Grolier, I think, is
Yeah.
of the West Coast. It was a book club that's established in near the turn of the century. She became the president of that, and so she was already in books. She was a supporter of the opera, a supporter of the symphony her whole life.
She's a single lone woman then at this point.
Oh, yes.
40s.
Now in the 40s she was doing that. She had fallen in love with books earlier. I mean, this was after she married Jack Walter. Sometime in the teens, she was part of the Book Club of California, so she was interested in books, and they knew her name, and she was part of the collector circle. People knew that if you wanted to, if you had a limited edition coming out, that Florence Schwartz Walter would be available to purchase, to be part of that. So she already had these gorgeous books. What she didn't have was any lessons or skills in binding. And this occurred after her husband's death. Probably in the 1930s she began. I don't remember her teachers, but there were a couple of famous teachers, women in San Francisco, and then in Paris. She went to Paris to learn as well. So she was well known in the book world, in that particular book world, but she was not selling any of these.
So people would come to her house, perhaps,
Yeah,
and admire her work,
that's right.
or she might show them at a Grolier Club meeting. She might bring them out.
She might bring them out, or she may give them to somebody. But in the 1956 Brussels Fair, 2 of her books represented America at that World's Fair, so she was extremely well known. She was a woman of real note.
And what became of her collection upon her demise?
Ah, yes. What became? I grew up in a matriarchy. It was the women who were not only the loudest, but also the strongest. And so women were always in my life. They brought me up. They sat on top of me. One of them lifted me up to great heights with love.
You mean that love, with love?
Yeah. And which saved my life, literally saved my life, while she sacrificed hers. That's a different story.
The fathers, were they absent because of their work, or because emotionally they just weren't available to their sons?
Both. My cousin, the oldest son of my uncle, there were three Sinton boys and 3 Walter girls. 2 of the Sinton boys married 2 of the Walter girls, and the other Walter married kind of an awful guy in the hide trade. All Jews, of course. They all married Jews.
This awful guy married?
Marjorie, the middle child, and then the middle son of Sinton, the middle Sinton son married a different person, but all Jewish. This was still quite a Jewish family.
So you were talking about the matriarchy and being raised?
Yes, but being raised by women. I was expected to go into business. Men just made money. That's what they did. They made money. Except for Bobby. Well, he did a lot of things, but we were all expected to make money. He was a stockbroker like his father.
Were you trained growing up in the art of making money?
No, I was left alone. In my particular family, they were too busy. My parents were just too busy with other things to bother much with me, which also saved my life.
Why do you say that?
Because they captured my oldest sister, who was to become the next matriarch. It went from oldest daughter to oldest daughter. And my mother was expected to run the family as the oldest daughter, and my oldest sister Margot was expected to run the family. And she was really bitchy and mean. So I had a hard time dealing with her. And she was kind of like a Trump, gets everybody involved in all of this mishigas out here.
Intrigue.
Yeah. And so mostly they were off there. My middle sister kind of got left behind, except that my mother hated her and was jealous of her, and psychologically destroyed her. She and I were the ones who were the lovers of the family. And me, they just left me alone.
Were you the youngest?
I was the youngest.
You were an afterthought.
Mm-hmm. No, I wasn't an afterthought. I was meant to be a boy. My father wanted a boy. My father famously said after my mother announced she was pregnant, that she should just get rid of me. If it turned out to be another girl, just give her away. So this was 1939. Then the war came, and my father was away. He never left San Francisco, but he was on night duty much of the time, so I hardly ever saw him until I was 4 or 5 or so, except a few times. And my mother didn't know what to do with the boy. She just...
So who raised you?
My nanny.
You had a nanny?
Really, yes. Oh, yeah.
Her name was?
The first one was Jeevy, Miss Jeeves, who was my mother's nanny. Jeevy who was British, very British she was. You look like Mary Poppins. Just dead on she was. And she was extremely severe. So we had to toe the line, but she was very, very just.
Was she loving?
She was kind of, she was under that roughness.
And how long was she your nanny?
But she was, at least I knew she was just. This would have been, if I remember it, I would have been 6, maybe.
Till the age of 6. And then what happened?
And then Jeevy got too old and quit. And then we had Jonesy, Miss Jones, who was there for maybe 3 or 4 years, who really loved me and took care of me, much to the consternation of my oldest sister, who was Margot.
Yeah.
Who fortunately, since she's 8 years older than me, began to disappear from my life. So those were for the first few years. My mother was, she hated sex and she hated being a mother. It bothered her. It interrupted her life.
What did she want to do with her life?
She was an artist, and she was an artist of quite some renown, and she had an extremely busy social life that she loved.
What was her name again?
Nell Sinton, and you can look it up. You can Wikipedia her. You look her up online. She was an abstract expressionist, but she was absent from my life.
She was busy painting and hanging out with her
Absolutely.
intellectuals or whatever.
So I walked the streets of San Francisco as a kid. I was 10 years old. I could tell you, from South San Francisco up to North Beach. I would just go off for the day.
You would just wander off?
I would just wander off. I do to this day. My poor wife. She's always looking around. Where'd you go? Where'd you go?
Speaking about your wife, tell me about your wife and her name and where she comes from.
Oh, Wendy, yeah.
What her background is somewhat.
Wendy Weber's background is the opposite of mine. She came from a very modest family, although a little bit more than modest on her father's side. The Webers, her father was born in Ohio, the son of a doctor who remarried a German woman who was rather fierce, and unfortunately her father, who was not terribly bright, became just an angry man. So she grew up with a very angry man, and a mother who was bright but frustrated, came from Watertown, New York, up on the St. Lawrence River. They met and married in New York City. I think, I'm not sure what her father was doing there. This is she was born in 1943. She's a war baby born in Washington State. And her mother, who got a social work degree, never practiced it or wanted to become a social worker, became alcoholic. So Wendy was semi-abandoned. No, she wasn't semi-abandoned. She grew up as all children of alcoholics, not understanding normal. Is this normal? And only much later becoming aware of it. But her first inclination, having been brought up in that family, was to run. So she went as far away as they allowed her to college, which was in Ohio. She went to Denison, and then she went into the Peace Corps. In the 1960s, among the very first Peace Corps workers, went to the Philippines for 2 years, came back, and I met her in anthropology class while she was taking a master's degree in anthropology.
And when you met her, you knew that this was someone you wanted to be with? How soon did that happen?
Oh, I had gotten divorced. Well, let's take a step back. I was there because I was retraining, and I was a postdoc. Now, my first job, I think I said, was in Schenectady Union College, and I got fired.
Booted out. Yeah.
I got booted out. And I had to rebuild my life in a different way. Clearly, I had...
This is why you were still at Union?
I was at Union, yes.
Okay,
I was.
So where did you move on to from there?
I moved to...
This is where you retrained in anthropology?
North Amherst. I got an apartment. And I said, I'm through with Russian history right now. I want to do something that fulfills me. I had enough money to live on, still just to exist, which is all I wanted to do. And I wanted to be outdoors. Because
Nature. Nature.
I just had always loved the natural world. I did not become a scientist because my parents told me that I was not good in mathematics, and therefore I shouldn't be a scientist, so I kind of gave that up. I never even tried it. But I went back and said, somebody is going to want a PhD historian who is interested in combining the natural sciences and the humanities. So I tried a number of different places, and the most interesting thing, and the closest to my children, was at the University of Massachusetts, where I could write my own ticket, write a little research grant.
This is what you did?
And so that's what I did. So
what did you decide to work on?
I worked on a river, which I worked on the Charles River. I got a grant to, first of all, I was an instructor. I became an instructor without knowing very much at all about it, but I could teach. And, they always like teachers, and I could teach well. So I became an instructor in natural resource, introduction to natural resources. And I got a research grant from the Water Resources Center there to study the social and natural history of the Charles River as it became more and more polluted over the course of the 19th and 20th century. So I did that little research grant and became involved with my advisor at the time in doing environmental impact statements, because National Environmental Protection Act was passed then, following on the heels of that was the Wilderness
Preservation.
preservation and water resources, all of that.
So you
Came
stayed
at once in the
UMass
Nixon.
for a while. You stayed there.
I was, I came in 1967. Meanwhile, I retrained I had to take organic chemistry, and I had to be able to be literate in the natural sciences. So I took some basic courses, and organic chemistry, believe me, if you've already finished a doctorate and you're older than 25, it's not that hard. You can do it. Just, just memorize the shit. Just keep on moving. So I did my organic chemistry, limnology, which is the study of water bodies and how water moves, which still excites me to this day. That material I just gave to the 5th grade class, and they were amazed. Water.
So you started out studying rivers, and that has been kind of a theme in your life.
That's a theme in my life. I began as I write in the Mill River book. One of the first physical memories in my physical memory is holding on to my father's back, arms around his neck, floating down the Truckee River, the little rapids at the top, and then floating down the river, waiting for it to shallow out, and then drifting up in the back flow up to the head of the current, and then floating back down. Getting that sense, if you've ever done that, if you've ever been on rivers, there's a flow and a feel to it which allows you to feel safe. You shouldn't feel too safe. That's where it becomes dangerous. But it's like one of those really good skiers when you see them move. Like there's this feel, this sense of that you have found a medium that is home to you. So
embryonic fluid.
Yeah, very much so. So so that's really what.
So this is where you met Wendy.
So I met Wendy in anthropology, theory of anthropology. I knew that sociology wasn't going to take me very far. I wanted, in combining at least that kind of sociology, where it was all statistical. I had to take statistics too, and that's not that hard. So if you're going to combine the natural and social sciences, or the natural sciences and humanities, you've got to have a good grounding in some social science as well. And anthropology allowed me to understand cultural perspectives a lot better. That was important to me, of course. I'd lived in France by that time already. I mean, I'd lived in Paris for a year doing research on a PhD dissertation.
What was your dissertation on?
It was on a Turkic-speaking group, a Tartar group, on the Volga River in the 18th century, and their relationship to the central government, which was Catherine the Great. Catherine's government had in her enlightened, crazy Catherine. I mean, what's a princess from a German principality in the 18th century? What does she know? Anyway, she becomes the Empress of Russia. She's still speaking German, but she loves the Enlightenment of Europe, and so she wants to hear from all her people in Russia. She wants everybody to come together and tell her what their problems are. Emperors should never do that, right? Don't do that. You're gonna hear things you don't want to hear. But that, of course, is a treasure trove of material for 18th century Russia, and there isn't any primary source in 18th century Russia. Most of Russia is illiterate, and you get some stuff that, you get stuff from the church, mostly.
So you found the material in Paris that you were looking for?
Some material, yeah. other material not. I would act, no, that was a different topic, it turns out. And I found out while I was in Paris that that topic had been taken by somebody else, and you're not allowed to do,
Yeah.
So I did a different one, but I was in Paris working on dissertation.
Let's go back to UMass. So you did your time at UMass, a lot of environmental work, and is that when you went on to Stockton?
First, when
Basically, you ended up at Stockton and...
I ended up after we established a consulting firm.
You and your wife.
And my former advisor,
His name was?
his name was Carl Carlozzi, C-A-R-L-O-Z-Z-I. And our statistician, mathematician person was Jim Vilkitis, V-I-L-K-I-T-I-S. So it was Carlozzi, Sinton, and Vilkitis was the name of the firm. We did some of the very first environmental impact assessments that the Corps of Engineers, for example, ever did. People didn't know how to do these things in 1970, so we started doing...
You based out of Amherst.
Based out of Leverett, Amherst, yep. I still have, if you like, I still have a copy. I think I've got a card somewhere, but just to prove we're real. And so this new college opened up in southern New Jersey called Stockton, founded a year or two after University of California, Santa Cruz, and Hampshire College was founded at the same time, and Evergreen out in Washington, and there was Stockton. So they asked me to help form a new program, new environmental studies department. And, I was supposed to go there for 3 years or so, but we were there for 27, and my wife has not forgiven me.
And you spent those 27 years training a new generation and cadre of people
Yeah,
involved in the environment.
correct.
That's what you did.
Writing about the Pine Barrens and doing political work as well. That's a whole other thing. There's 20% of the state of New Jersey is in something called a national recreational area.
Was that your doing?
We helped to do that, yeah.
bring that about.
And worked, yeah. I was on a commission. I was politically active as well.
So you did, let's say, 30 years down there, and then you came back here?
Right.
Okay. What brought you back to the Valley?
We had two possibilities. In 1999 is when I retired after a year in Cologne. Right. 1999, we could have gone to the Bay Area, but I had left the Bay Area for a good reason. And thinking about going back there, even then, 20 years ago, it was not only expensive, but traffic was bad. And
So you decided to go back to the place you loved.
yeah.
Did you have children with Wendy also?
2.
So I'd like to ask you about your 5 children. Can you tell me their names? Let's start with the 3 you had with your first wife, if you'd be kind enough. Tell me their names and what became of them. As much as you wish to share.
Yeah, no. My first wife, 3 children, the oldest, Jonathan.
What became of Jonathan?
Well, I'll tell you those stories in a moment. Jonathan, who was born 1964, and then 1966, Christopher was born, and in 1967, Alex was born, so bam, bam, bam. By that time, 1967, I had discovered that I was changing, moving out to a different life. The oldest, Jonathan, is, what did he do? He went to Harvard. funny thing. He works very hard, he's very bright, and he also puts in a lot of time. He just went to public school in upstate New York, but he gets into RPI with a full scholarship, and he gets into Harvard with a partial scholarship. So he phones me that night. He says, I got into Harvard and I got into RPI. Where do you think I should go? My mother wants me to go to RPI because it's close to home. And it must have been at least 30 seconds. Are you crazy? I screamed in the phone. So he went to Harvard. Studied Chinese. Became a Chinese student of Chinese and Chinese literature, and then went to China for 2 or 3 years to study, to give English lessons. Married a Chinese woman. Yeah.
Okay.
And now, and went to Cal.
And what's he doing now?
And he became an expert in energy, and he's at the World Bank heading up the energy efficiency section, working on projects. Currently, mostly in the Middle East, he's finishing them off there, and going into sub-Saharan Africa. He's done a lot of work in China. Chris, the second one, went to Middlebury, became a geologist, got an advanced degree, got a geology, oceanography degree at Oregon State, studies underwater volcanoes, goes out to Galapagos and figures out the origin and movement of these islands, and now teaches environmental studies, the head of the department at Ithaca College. And the last one had all kinds of problems finding himself, of course. Went to Wesleyan and finally ended up as a mechanical engineer. So he got a master's in mechanical engineering. He's a mechanical engineer. Finally, he settles in Doylestown, and he does fine.
Now, the 2 children you've had with Wendy? Oh, before I get there.
Yeah.
Did you have an impact on them when they were teenagers? Were you able to
Yes.
see them more often?
Yeah.
Did they come to live with you?
Yeah. They never quite lived, but we, as they tell me, we saved them from the horrors of their home life. We showed them that there was an alternative way
When they came to your life,
Yeah.
to your house.
We were absolutely, I've found that was critical. I learned how to be a father. I knew I had left my family of origin for some reason, and perhaps that reason was to discover my vocation as a father. And that has been foremost in my life, the rest of my life. That year, that horrible year, reordered my priorities quite strictly. So I always knew there was fatherhood foremost and family first.
Were you able, on this subject, to reconcile with your father having not gone in the direction he expected,
Yeah.
having gone in a totally unique way to find yourself, and kind of disappointed him, in a sense?
Not even kind of.
It disappointed him. Were you
Yes.
able to reconcile and have that
Yes.
conversation with him?
Yeah, not that conversation, because he wouldn't have understood the conversation. But I was able to give him credit for being an extraordinarily good businessman, being very light on his feet, and
Fred Astaire?
yeah, just being able to move and manipulate. And from him, I got considerable abilities, charm, but an understanding of what charm means, and that he didn't understand how evil it is. He didn't
Manipulation and false face.
Yeah. But what else did I get from him? Maybe intellect, I don't know.
Tell me about the two children that you had with Wendy.
Oh, it's interesting. In many ways, the older, well, no, it's not, it's explicable for sure. The older boys are more dependent on me in many ways than the younger ones. In other words, they will come to me for advice or seek me out more quickly than the younger ones. Because they lived me, the younger ones lived with me, they know me better, or they know me in a different way. Josh, who was born in 1971, was a joyful, beautiful little boy, but we lived in South Jersey and he got picked on, and he tended to have a certain depressed emotional part, which has run in both my family and Wendy's. There is some, I suppose, depression in most families, a little bit somewhere, but a little bit more in Josh, and he took it. He takes it worse than others. That when things go against him, it's really hard on him. So he went into kind of a druggy phase in high school, and we saved him by sending him off to what do they call it? The Friends, where they send kids off to Europe, or to some other country. AFS, sorry. He went off for a year. We grabbed him, took him out of school, sent him off to AFS. He wanted to go to Egypt. I don't know why. This is 1990, I guess, something like that. And so he ends up in Jerusalem. And he learns Hebrew. And he does not become Jewish, oddly enough. I mean, he doesn't become deeply Jewish, but he goes to high school, the music high school in Jerusalem. And he falls in love with music. He liked music anyway. And he witnesses the first Intifada. What year is that? 91 maybe?
Yeah, around there.
Yeah. So he gets rid of all of his whatever druggy parts. Life is serious. He discovers that life really has a serious side to it. And then when he came back, there was 1 year left. He went to Quaker school outside of Philadelphia. And then he went to University of Chicago, where he got heavily into music. Graduated from there and then went to New England Conservatory. He is a jazz musician in New York. He married a woman whose family comes from some wealth, so he can afford to be a musician, and enjoys that part of it. Has an on and off relationship with his parents, a semi-difficult one. Toby, born in 1975, the opposite of Josh. Loved public school, loved running, he was an athlete, loved being with Billy and the other boys. He just very much fish and water, very happy with that. I mean, so happy we were afraid we were going to lose him to South Jersey. This kind of... So we shipped him off to Thailand for a summer to learn about what it is to work with other people. And that made a difference, I think, in his life. He didn't catch on to anything in particular. He did fine in high school. Went to Cornell, fell in love with a beautiful architecture student there his last year. He almost flunked out his senior year. We threatened him with no more money, never. So,
Stay in the man.
So then he moved out with his girlfriend to San Francisco, to the Bay Area. And all of a sudden he got this idea, wanted to go to med school. After volunteering in a public health clinic. So he said, I'm going to med school. His girlfriend says, yeah, right, get out of here. I'm not going to support you going to med school. He's going to go back east for med school. He has to go to do what's called a post-bac. He goes to Bennington, comes out of there, goes to Pitt, does very well at Pitt, does his residency at University of Washington, becomes chief res at University of Washington, marries one of his residents, becomes a doctor and settles still on staff in Washington. So as the son we don't get along with quite as well as others said to me, you've got 5 boys who do these wonderful things that they love. You can't complain about anything ever again. That's my lesson.
And you have grandchildren?
Yes, we have 11 grandchildren, 8 of whom are girls, which makes Wendy feel like she's in heaven. So every year we have girls' camp, and the granddaughters come up and spend a week at girls' camp, writing with crayons in the driveway, no boys allowed.
Let me bring this full circle now. How would you now characterize yourself as a Jewish person, having gone through this journey? How do you see Judaism as it is represented in your life or your beliefs at this point of your life? And of your 5 kids?
5
boys.
5 boys, yeah.
Of your 5 boys, are any of them identified as Jewish, or have they all kind of gone the way of part of your family that says, we can dance with it, but we're not really part of it? This is kind of to complete the circle.
Yeah. The easy to answer the last first. Let's see. The oldest of ours, Wendy's and mine, and the oldest of the first marriage have the most understanding that they are Jews. One of them even, when he was living in Hong Kong, went to temple with his son for a while, but he doesn't do that anymore. Josh just knows that he's Jewish. He doesn't go to temple or go to service. But he's played in klezmer bands and he knows how to be Jewish. The others maybe not so much. As for me, there's a little section in my life when I became Catholic even, but that's a different story. When I was trying to save my first marriage, I became Catholic for maybe a year. Different story, interesting but not quite relevant. But it does indicate how far I had strayed from being a Jew. I have always known deeply culturally that I'm a Jew. I, even when I was a teenager, I had not conflicting ideas about it, but an understanding that I could not, if I truly didn't believe in the religion, didn't believe in God, nor could I answer the question, why do you have a Christmas tree? I couldn't be bar mitzvahed, even though my family dangled some rewards in front of me. I loved Hebrew. I forgot all of it, but I loved the language, and I loved the music, and I loved the Rebbe, the cantor, in particular, cantor Rinder, very much part of my life. I've always heard Jewish music. I've always known that I couldn't be other than a Jew. I think Jews are the most hilarious people in the world. They are just, I don't know what I would do with myself if I couldn't make a Jewish show. I just don't know it makes me, every so often it makes me weep to know what a beautiful, extraordinary tradition I've inherited, and that my passion comes from being a Jew. My passion for the world and for equality, for excellence, to be as good as you can. All of that, I think, comes from being a Jew, not from being from my family, that's for sure. But at the end of my life, I'm a Jew, and it thrills me.